In 2 weeks and 1 day, we're going to enter into the offering of first fruits. How do we know that it's the offering of first fruits? So one of the things that people say is that the offering of first fruits was the day after Jesus was crucified, because he was the first fruits to God. Well, all they're doing is putting together a story, because Leviticus 23 says, "Speak to the Israelites and say to them, when you enter the land I'm going to give you and you reap its harvest, bring to the priest a sheaf of the first grain you harvest. He is to wave the sheaf before the Lord so it will be accepted on your behalf. The priest is to wave it on the day after the Sabbath." Well, guess what? The day after Jesus was crucified was not the Sabbath. Other people say that it was the third day. So he was crucified on the 14th, the 15th, then the 16th. So that would have been the day after the Sabbath. However, the specification and the basis by which we are going to understand every offering of first fruits going forward is this: when you enter the land I'm going to give you. That is the basis by which we are understanding when the offering of first fruits is. It has to be the day after the Sabbath. It has to be when they enter the land that he gave them. So let's go to the place that describes when they entered the land that he gave them. Joshua 5. On the evening of the 14th day of the month, while camped at Gilgal on the plains of Jericho, the Israelites celebrated the Passover. Okay, there are two situations in which scripture refers to the Passover. Sometimes it just refers to that first day, which is the 14th. The 14th on God's calendar, by the way. The second example is when it refers to the entire festival of Passover, which is the 14th through the 21st, which includes the 14th, on which the Passover lamb was sacrificed and the meal is eaten, and then the next 7 days of the festival of unleavened bread. All of that is referred to as the Passover. Luke 22:1 tells you that the festival of unleavened bread is also the Passover. So now we got to figure out, well, what context is scripture using here? On the evening of the 14th day of the month, while camped at Gilgal on the plains of Jericho, the Israelites celebrated the Passover. The day after the Passover, that very day, they ate some of the produce of the land, unleavened bread and roasted grain. The manna stopped the day after they ate this food from the land. There was no longer any manna for the Israelites, but that year they ate the produce of Canaan. All right, so Leviticus 23 has criteria. Now we have more criteria here in Joshua 5. The criteria in Leviticus 23 is that it's when they enter the land he's going to give them, and they reap the harvest. They have to bring to the priest a sheaf of the first grain they harvest, but they have to wave it the day after the Sabbath. Well, the day after the 14th is a Sabbath, so it can't be that definition of Passover, being the 15th of the month. Can't possibly be that. So we know that the first offering of first fruits was the 22nd of the month. Now, the 22nd of that particular month, which happened to be Nisan, is not always Nisan, by the way. So notice that you have in Leviticus 23, you have season-specific holy days, the offering of first fruits, and Pentecost, or the Festival of Weeks, and the rest of the holy days are date-specific. There's a clear distinction between the two. Now, why would God not give us a date for the offering of first fruits? Well, is God known to tell you ahead of time when he's going to do something? Not really. And by the way, he already gave the Israelites an opportunity to enter the land of Canaan, but they would not go and do it. They were afraid. They were afraid to possess it. So he made them wander for 40 more years and brought them into the land of Canaan at a different time. But he didn't tell them ahead of time when he was going to do it. You know, he doesn't do that really with us now. He hasn't told me when he's going to sell that building or what he's going to do. He doesn't lay out the itinerary. He requires us to trust and believe in the things that he has told us. So he didn't give them a date, but we know what date it was because it was the day after the Passover. It was the 22nd of the month because the Passover ends on the 21st. Now, some years, in fact, most years, offering of first fruits is going to land on the 23rd because you're not always going to have, in a 360-day year, you're not always going to have the month of Nisan landing in the same season. It's going to make its way all around the seasonal calendar. So we have to remember, based on the moon, which is what God established in order as the faithful witness in the sky, to help us to keep track of things. In fact, there are farmers who actually farm based on the moon. Wonder where they learned that from. So whatever the month is on God's calendar, it's going to be the 22nd or the 23rd of that particular month. We could also say it's going to be the last quarter moon of the month, or during that time, because that could last a couple days. You'll know exactly when it is because it's going to be a week after your full moon Sabbath, the day after the Sabbath. Most of the time, it's going to land on the 23rd of God's month. Why the 23rd? Because except for the month of Nisan, the 23rd is the day after the Sabbath. In the month of Nisan, you have Passover lasting until the 21st of the month, which is a Sabbath. And so that changes your Sabbath days, at least for that last week of the month. The barley harvest has been argued and argued and argued based on the Gregorian calendar. Now, do you think God might send delusion if people are insisting on basing what he has established on a prostitute calendar? Do you think he might send delusion? Well, yeah. This is why no one can come to any kind of consensus as to when the offering of first fruits is, when the barley harvest actually exists. We know that the barley harvest is going to happen somewhere between the end of March, early April. The only reason I'm using Gregorian months is because we cannot, is as a point of reference for that season. End of March, early April. All you have to do is look for that last quarter moon in whatever month you're in at that particular season. It's going to be the last quarter moon, and it will be either the 22nd if it's the month of Nisan, or it will be the 23rd if it's a regular Sabbath month. So God uses some peculiar language regarding how to count down from the offering of first fruits to the festival of Pentecost, or the festival of weeks. He says count down 7 weeks up to the 50th day. Well, 7 weeks is 49 days. Why does he say up to the 50th day? Because he's telling you to count down 7 weeks and then you add a day. And the reason he's doing that is because God does not have a relentless series of weeks like the Roman calendar does. God has a 30-day month, and a week is defined by 6 days of work and 1 day of rest. 7 days, but 6 days of work and 1 day of rest. The beginning of the month, the first day of the month, is set on the new moon. That starts your month, and it's a day of rest. So that's not starting a week. The day after is starting a week. If there are 30 days in a month, and 30 is not evenly divisible by 7, there can only be 4 weeks in a month with 2 days that do not fit into a week. So you have the first day of the month, which is a day of rest. Then you have a series of 4 consecutive weeks. Then another day, which is a work day. That's the 30th day of the month. And then you start over by the moon, first day, day of rest. And again, 4 sets of 7-day weeks, a day of work, and then start over to a day of rest. And that's how God's months go. This is why he uses that weird language. Otherwise, he could have just said, count off 50 days. That's not what he said, is it? Why do you think? Because we've been practicing something that does not make sense to the language that God is using. And God said that he removed his calendar and his set times because of wickedness, but he is restoring them again. We knew that he was going to restore them because he told us in the word that he would take them away. And then he tells us later in the word that we're going to observe them. So obviously he's got to restore them. So when you're counting down from the offering of first fruits, you need to take this. You need to remember this, that there's going to be, I think it's 56 days in between, something like that. The other thing you're going to need to remember is that when I say that a week is from April 3rd to April 10th, well, that's technically 8 days, isn't it? Except that what we're calling a day is actually split between 2 days. God's day begins in the evening. And so what I'm actually saying is the evening of April 3rd to just before evening on April 10th is a week, is 7 days. All right, let's go ahead and look at the calendar for April 2024. The first week is usually going to start with the 23rd. Remember why I said that. The 23rd is the day after the Sabbath, except for that month of Nisan, because the Passover ends on the 21st. So it disrupts that cycle of 6 work days and 1 rest day. Okay, so we're going to look at April 2024. The 23rd is going to begin on the 2nd of April, in the evening on the 2nd of April. So when I say to you that the evening of the 2nd of April until the 9th of April is 1 week. What I'm saying is, on a typical week, you're going to have the day beginning in the evening and then a new day beginning the next evening, right? So this would be the day beginning in the evening on the 2nd, and then just before evening on the 9th, that week is ending and that day is ending. So that is 7 days. Now, in this particular situation, of course, there has to be a wrench thrown in here. There are certain new moons in which, and by the way, we're talking about crescent moons, in which if science were to call this, science would call this a 29-day lunar month. But that can't be possible with God. He's already told us that there are 30 days in his month. He's not changing that. In this particular month, you're going to have the 8th to the 9th representing the 29th of the month. That evening will begin the 30th until morning. So evening to morning in Genesis, this shouldn't trip you up. Genesis says evening to morning, and there was the first day. When the new moon comes up on the 10th, crescent new moon, not what the world calls the new moon, not what science calls the new moon, but the crescent. When that comes up in the morning, that's going to begin new moon day. And then by evening, so it's kicked out the previous day, and by evening, that will begin the second day. It does make it a little confusing on those months, but that's how God defines a day, and doesn't really matter. I mean, there are confusing things in science that, are relentless, and they change the rules all the time, so surely we can wrap our hearts around what does not change, which is what God has established. That's the only thing that matters, right? Okay, so we have our first week from the evening of the 2nd until just before evening on the 9th. Now we have a new week that's starting with what? The day after new moon. So new moon is going to be on the 10th. That evening until just before evening on the 17th. There's week 2. Evening of the 17th to just before evening on the 24th. That's week 3. Evening of the 24th to just before the evening of May 1st is going to be week 4. Evening of May 1st to just before the evening of the 8th of May is going to be week 5. Now in the month of May, we have new moon on the 10th. That's the first day of the month, from the evening of the 9th to the 10th, to just before evening of the 10th. So we have a new day starting on the evening of the 10th. So that's going to be from the 10th until the 17th. That's our 6th week. Then the evening of the 17th until the 24th. That's our 7th week. The evening of the 24th is going to begin that 50th day, because remember, we don't count 49 days, we count 50 days to Pentecost. Okay, so we have this year, May 25th, 2024, is going to be Pentecost. And technically from the evening of the 24th to the evening of the 25th. So we'll have 2 Sabbaths in a row every year at Pentecost, because it's always going to land on the 16th of the month, and the 15th is always a Sabbath. And Pentecost is always observed as a Sabbath. The offering of first fruits, you notice, was not. Why is that? Because we're reaping the harvest, and we're bringing the sheaf of the wave offering to the priest to wave it on our behalf before God, to be accepted on our behalf. So work was definitely happening on that day, and continues to happen, because this is what we would be doing. So the offering of first fruits is always going to land during the barley harvest, late March, early April, on the 22nd or 23rd of God's month, the 22nd during the month of Nisan, the 23rd during every other month. It's got to be the day after the Sabbath. It cannot land on the Sabbath. Pentecost is always going to land on the 16th in the month of May. In months where there are 2 full moons, you can count back from offering of first fruits. You should be doing that anyway. So it shouldn't be confusing for you. It is not usually going to land. I don't believe I've seen a case in which it lands during the first week of May, or I should say early in the first week of May. Last year, Pentecost landed on the 7th of May. Usually it's going to land somewhere in mid-May. It won't land too late in May, and it won't land too early. So even with this, you have that it's landing on the 25th, and you still have 6 more days of the month left. It's usually not going to land at least I have not seen an example in which it lands during the latter 6 days of the month or the early 6 days of the month of May. So it will always land on the 16th of God's month. So why didn't he give us a date? Well, there's a couple reasons. One is what I explained to you earlier, which is God specified when you enter the land I'm going to give you. He didn't tell them up front when he was going to give them the land. The other reason is the months change. So the offering of first fruits could land on the 23rd of any one of those 11 months, except for the month of Nisan, in which it's going to land on the 22nd, right? And Pentecost could land on the 16th of any one of the 12 months. So which month would God have told us? And you might say, well, he could have at least told us that Pentecost was going to land on the 16th and that the offering of first fruits would land on the 22nd or 23rd. But you know what? God removed his calendar because of wickedness. We would have understood this if we hadn't become wicked. We would have continued to track it. And we got there. We were able to get there. But God requires us to work for his heart. He gave us enough information. He gave us the information that was necessary to understand that when we entered the land that he was going to give us, that was when we were to harvest and bring the sheaf of the wave offering to the priest to be waved on our behalf. My daughter mentioned something interesting earlier. I think we had talked about this before. She talked about Jesus being our high priest, and he is the one who waves the offering before God to be accepted on our behalf. We can't just approach God. We can't just be like, I want to be your son. I want to be your bride. I want to be a child of God. No, we have to go through Jesus. No one gets to the Father without Jesus. Now, do you see why it does not make sense for people to say that the offering of first fruits, that they make up this whole story about, well, because Jesus is referred to as the offering of first fruits, then it has to be on the third day when he rose, he was offered as a first fruits to God, and therefore there's the story. It does not make sense according to, it's a nice story, but it doesn't make sense with the rest of Scripture, especially when Leviticus 23 says, when you enter the land I'm going to give you, and then we go to Joshua 5 and we see, the land, when they entered the land was during Passover, and then after Passover is when they reap the harvest. So we already know that the date of the offering of first fruits has been set in reference to that event. It doesn't change Jesus being the first fruits to God. It just, we aren't going to add anything to the scroll that isn't there, guys. The offering of first fruits occurred on the 22nd of the month of Nisan in the year that the Israelites entered the land that God gave them. We don't have necessarily a seasonal calendar or marker aside from it, that God has provided us. If we're working the land, then we already know, right? We know when the barley harvest is, but in the absence of that, we'll go ahead and utilize the Gregorian calendar for this purpose because we're all familiar with it. The barley harvest occurs at the end of March, early April. The reason people argue about this all the time is because they keep trying to set a date according to the Gregorian calendar, not according to what God has established. If they knew that when the Israelites entered the land, that it was on the 22nd, which would have made it the last quarter moon, then they could say, hey, during the last quarter moon, that's when we're going to harvest the barley. And during the full moon, that's when we're in what we're calling May. During the full moon, that's when we're going to harvest the wheat, except not on Sabbath, right? That's when the wheat harvest festival is going to occur. That's when we're going to make leavened bread. So let's read what we do there. From the day after the Sabbath, this is Leviticus 23, verse 15. From the day after the Sabbath to the day you brought the sheaf of the wave offering, count off 7 full weeks. Count off 50 days up to the day after the 7th Sabbath. And then present an offering of new grain to the Lord. From wherever you live, bring 2 loaves made of 2/10 of an ephah of the finest flour baked with yeast as a wave offering of first fruits to the Lord. Present this bread, 7 male lambs, each a year old and without defect, 1 young bull and 2 rams. They will be a burnt offering to the Lord, together with their grain offerings and drink offerings, a food offering, an aroma pleasing to the Lord. Then sacrifice 1 male goat for a sin offering and 2 lambs, each a year old, for a fellowship offering. The priest is to wave the 2 lambs before the Lord as a wave offering together with the bread of the first fruits. They are a sacred offering to the Lord for the priest. On that same day you are to proclaim a sacred assembly and do no regular work. This is to be a lasting ordinance for the generations to come wherever you live. When you reap the harvest of your land, do not reap to the very edges of your field or gather the gleanings of your harvest. Leave them for the poor and for the foreigner residing among you. I am the Lord your God. Okay, so no, there isn't necessarily a command to wave the sheaf on Pentecost from what I can see, at least here in Leviticus 23. So I am assuming, based on what they're cooking, that they're making 2 loaves of 2/10 of an ephah of the finest flour baked with yeast as a wave offering. I am assuming that they've already harvested the grain, harvested the wheat during the Festival of Weeks, and that's what they're making their bread with. Something interesting here that I had realized years ago is that, first of all, the Festival of Weeks is the very day that the witnesses were anointed, the apostles were anointed. It is representing first fruits, which the servants of God are, and there's a very specific recipe for this bread. From wherever you live, bring 2 loaves made of 2/10 of an ephah of the finest flour, baked with yeast as a wave offering of first fruits to the Lord. Now, during Passover, the only specification for this recipe was to bake bread without yeast. Here you're baking bread with yeast and with 2/10 of an ephah of the finest flour. Now, 2/10 is kind of a weird way to say that. How come they didn't reduce it to 1/5? Well, when you reduce it to 1/5, you get the very amount that God commanded be added to the value of something that you were redeeming. So this is representing those who have been redeemed. And you see that this is the wave offering that is being presented to the Lord on your behalf, to be accepted before the Lord on your behalf. This does not take away from the fact that on Passover, God said, you're to eat unleavened bread because you left Egypt in such haste that you weren't able to add any yeast to your dough. Well, that's kind of funny because God told them to clean out their house, clean out the yeast from their house. So of course they didn't add any yeast. There was no yeast in their house. But God wanted them to remember that they had left Egypt in haste. I do also believe that he wants us to remember that yeast is sin, and that bread represents a sinless and blameless Christ. And that this bread, very specific recipe, is representing those who have been redeemed and will be redeemed by God. Those who have yeast, who have sin, but have been made blameless, have been justified before God through faith, and have been redeemed at that very price that he indicated of 1/5 of the value of that thing being added, that thing or that person. Okay, I hope this has been easy enough to follow along with. It is cumbersome. It is cumbersome to understand. So keep at it and ask your questions as you need to ask them. And always discern with God.